Hello, today is Friday, April 24th, 2020. I'm Joe Schmidt with TC2, and this is Staying Connected. This is part 2 of our 2-part podcast series where we're laying out what you need to do to get a solid contract in place when using a portfolio strategy for buying internet transport services. I'm again joined by my colleagues, Mark Sheard, TC2's UK Managing Director, and Laura McDonald, a Senior Partner with LB3. Welcome back, guys. Laura, we ended the first podcast talking about contract terms and conditions. As the attorney amongst us, I think you have a few things to say about T's and C's.
Joe, thanks, and always. But I'm not going to cover all the T's and C's. We'd be here all day. What I want to do is call out some based on what I see are the most critical or often used terms. And many of these Mark mentioned in our earlier podcast. First, commitments around billing errors and late billing. This often comes up. Second, reporting obligations to help you track and install circuit terms. This also helps you correct and identify late billing and billing errors. Precedence of the DIA schedule and the access schedules over service orders. So don't let a situation arise where the carrier gives you a service order with adverse terms and that trumps your negotiated agreements. And that goes for all your negotiated agreements. They should always take precedence over any online terms or service orders. Next, you want to make sure that there is clear language over any commitments that apply and clear and reasonable termination charges. Now, the carriers vary as to the structure of the termination charges, and this is something hopefully you've fleshed out as part of your RFP process. But at a very minimum, you need to make sure that you never pay more to terminate than you do to keep a service in place. You also need to make sure the rates are fixed. This seems like a no-brainer, but you would be surprised at how many contracts come back with discounts off of scheduled rates or illustrative rates, which means something very different than fixed rates for your contract terms. Speaking of that, you need to make sure at the end of your term, if you don't have it already in your MSA, that you have at least a 6-month transition period where you have the same rates but no commitments and the same terms apply. After that, I suggest you also have a month-to-month provision that allows you to keep the rates fixed so that you're not looking at a cliff. And then finally, special construction. When you're rolling out a lot of new access, especially if it's a higher capacity access, you could easily run into special construction issues. Terms are pretty easy to negotiate up front, but you don't want those delaying the implementation of the special access. So put them in now. So if you find yourself in a special access or construction situation, you'll have an opportunity to only focus on what are the rates and not have to worry about the terms.
So, Laura, what are some of the practical steps that companies need to take, and I guess what insights can you share for getting through this process with little pain and achieving a successful outcome?
Well, Joe, I can't promise no pain, but what I can do is give you a few tips to make this a little more efficient and a little less painful. So let me take a shot at that. Some things that spring to mind are be practical. You have a number of schedules to get through, and particularly if you're dealing with a number of vendors, you need to know what's important. Generally, you can and should do any amendments to your MSAs, but let the suppliers draft the schedules. Taking this approach both spreads the load when you have multiple suppliers and contracts, but it also stops you from trying to shoehorn suppliers into a level of standardization that could take a great deal of effort to achieve, but probably isn't necessary. The downside here is something that we talked about on the last podcast. You run the risk that the vendors are going to send you back schedules which are just cookie cutter and are not going to reflect your RFP. So always be on the watch out for that. Know what's most important to you. Don't sweat the minutia. That's not going to affect your service. In order to keep you in line on this, create a cheat sheet so you know in advance what's most important to you and your team, and update that cheat sheet to keep track of the issues and to reprioritize as may be necessary. Finally, be prepared for supplier pushback. If they tell you that they have never seen a draft so marked up, then you can tell them that either, 1, they haven't done a deal with a sophisticated customer before, in which case, why are you sitting across from them? Or 2, in the past they did a better job of marking up the paper to reflect the deal. I had this happen just recently where the supplier objected to provisions that we added in that were in their existing agreement with the supplier. So prepare for these responses so that they don't create unnecessary delay or angst or leverage.
So, Mark, what do you think? Do you have anything to add to that list?
Yes, I do, Joe. Laura and I are pretty aligned on taking a pragmatic approach wherever possible. But that doesn't mean rolling over or being worn down by initial disconnects between you and the bidder on the commitments that they made in the RFP. And these things do happen in the drafting. So to Laura's point, remain vigilant. I can't emphasize enough that you really reap what you sow from the RFP process, and the clarity and the consistency and the focus that you put on key topics in the RFP response, review and negotiations will make the contract closure much, much easier. And even with the threat, which is real, of awarding less business, there is less leverage in the final stages of the contract closure. So some of the things perhaps that you should look at to try and ensure timely contract closure, they'll include, in the RFP process, make sure that timely provision of draft schedules is one of your decision criteria, and let the supplier know that. Stick as far as possible to what you agreed, unless something untoward or unexpected comes to light. This approach will make closure much easier. As Laura mentioned, use markups to capture and close points. Certainly don't rely on general discussions or notes that don't specifically relate to drafts at this stage. Verify as well what the suppliers have taken away from any asks you have in review. The number of times I've had a conversation with the supplier and he's hearing something or she's hearing something different for what I'm saying. So always be prepared to verify and check that and ensure that messages are not corrupted. That will ease the path forward. It's also important to establish a sufficiently frequent cadence for updates and review. These things can suddenly slip onto a back burner when the assumption of business being won has been made by the bidder. I would also say from the customer and the enterprise side, work really hard to review the submissions you get from the providers quickly and get them back to them quickly. In this way, you won't get bogged down. And if you are timely, it will encourage the supplier to be timely as well and should add some momentum to the process.
True, Mark. I agree with all of your points. With a little organization, you can minimize the impact of contracting with multiple suppliers. Work with your counsel. You want to get them involved so that they can catch problems early. You don't want to get to the end and find out that something significant was left out or misworded. However, you don't want counsel to unnecessarily slow the process either. From the counsel perspective, I find the best way to address this is to work together and be clear about what is important and what risk you're willing to take. Counsel's job is to point out the risk, and your job is to decide what risk you can live with. If you disagree with your counsel disagrees with you, discuss why. While some minutia doesn't seem important, it is actually deal changing. On the other side, most will agree that if it is not truly material, it's not a material business or legal risk. You don't want the inconsequential to take over or unnecessarily delay the process. Finally, send a clear message to your suppliers. The contract matters. They must be willing to commit on paper to what they said during the RFP process, and they must be nimble and receptive. None of this, the product house or legal can't commit to that when the RFP team did.
Okay, Mark, I'll give you the last word. Any final thoughts?
Thanks, Joe. Contracting with a portfolio of suppliers doesn't have to be unduly painful. And while it is a little more effort, if you've done your work in the RFP, you stay practical and you focus on the important items, you can get it all done without getting bogged down. And once you do, you have the undoubted benefits that go with implementing an internet transport provider portfolio strategy.
Okay, thanks, guys. You've provided some great insight. Now, if you're developing your internet-first strategy, or you are well on your way to buying internet transport and would like to discuss it with Laura, Mark, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues, please give us a call or drop us an email. If you missed the first podcast of this series, or the two-part podcast series that we recorded about using a portfolio strategy for buying internet transport, they're available on our websites. They're also available on any number of podcast platforms like Apple and Spotify, and they are also available on our LinkedIn pages. You'll find it easy to stay current by subscribing to Staying Connected, periodically checking out the new content on our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.